There are words you don't forget. They land in your chest like a stone, and no matter how many years pass, you can still feel the weight of them pressing down. For me, those words came from my own son. My name is Dennis Flores, though most people just call me Dennis. I suppose names don't matter much in the quiet of old age, but they matter when you realize they're being erased from your own family's story. We were standing in his wide, open kitchen, the kind you see in glossy magazines. Granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, a chandelier that glowed even at midday. He was pouring himself a cup of coffee, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than my monthly wages ever did. He didn't look at me when he said it. "I don't need you anymore, Dad." He spoke casually, like he was discussing the weather or the stock market or some client he had closed a deal with. He stirred sugar into his coffee, clinked the spoon against the mug, and sipped. And just like that, 30 years of fatherhood were dismissed with 7 little words. I remember blinking at him as if maybe I had misheard. Surely my boy, the one I once carried on my shoulders through crowded parades, the one I taught to ride a bike in the cracked alley behind our old house, couldn't have said that. Surely he remembered. But his eyes stayed fixed on the coffee. He cleared his throat and added, "You've done enough. I've got it from here. Done enough." He didn't mean it as gratitude. He meant it as finality, as closure. Like a business transaction settled, a debt cleared. I wanted to tell him that fatherhood doesn't work like that, that love isn't a loan to be repaid, nor a ladder you step off once you've reached the roof. But I didn't. Instead, I smiled, the way you do when you don't want the crack in your chest to show on your face. The truth is, fathers don't stop needing their children either. Not in the way people imagine. It's not about money or help lifting heavy boxes or remembering birthdays. It's about being wanted. About knowing that the space you carved out in their lives isn't sealed off with concrete once they grow into their own. When Michael was a boy, he needed me for everything. For shoelaces, for scraped knees, for late-night fevers and rides to baseball practice. He needed my hands, my voice, my presence, and oh, how gladly I gave them. But children grow. They reach for other hands, other voices. You want them to, of course, you want them to be strong, independent, proud. Still, when the day comes that they say they don't need you anymore, it doesn't feel like independence. It feels like exile. That night I lay in my quiet house, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the old wall clock. I thought about the journey from his first cry in a hospital room, slick and red and new, to his declaration in that gleaming kitchen. I remembered the nights I worked double shifts, cement dust still clinging to my hair when I tucked him into bed. I remembered the Christmases I skipped buying myself a coat so he could have the toy he'd circled in the catalog. And I remembered the sound of his voice when he was small, Daddy, bright, unguarded, full of trust. Now, the word Dad had been stripped of warmth, spoken like a title past its expiration date. People say pride is the hardest thing for a father to swallow. They are wrong, it's indifference. Pride hurts, sure, it can sting when your child thinks they are above you, when success blinds them to the shoulders they stood on. But indifference, that empties you out, that makes you invisible. That was the night I realized my son no longer saw me. Not as the man who raised him, not even as the old fool who once believed he'd always be needed. To him, I was just unnecessary. I told myself I could live with it. Fathers live with worse, don't they? Broken promises, missed calls, holidays spent alone. I told myself I would take his words, fold them neatly like an old letter, and tuck them away in the drawer of my heart. But what I didn't know, what neither of us could have known, was that life has a way of reopening drawers you thought were shut forever. And sometimes the phone rings. And sometimes the call comes from a hospital. And sometimes the very child who said he doesn't need you anymore will discover, in the most unexpected, heartbreaking way, that he does. I didn't answer that call yet. That comes later. But if you want to understand how a father gets to the point where his own son banishes him from his life, you have to begin here in this kitchen with the sting of those words. You have to begin with me standing in silence, a half-empty mug on the counter, the hum of a refrigerator filling the space where once there had been laughter, because that's where the story of what came next truly begins. Michael's house always felt like a showroom. Every time I stepped through the tall glass doors, I had the strange sensation that I should take my boots off, not because the carpet was delicate, but because I might scuff the illusion. Everything gleamed. Polished marble floors, recessed lighting, a grand staircase with no creak in its steps. The place smelled faintly of eucalyptus and expensive candles, the kind that came in jars too pretty to throw away. It wasn't just a house. It was a performance, a declaration of what he had built for himself. I should have been proud, and on some level I was. Any father who raised a boy in a two-bedroom house with leaky pipes would feel a swell of pride to see him standing in a place like this. But pride has a way of tangling with something else, distance. The more I looked around, the more I saw a world that didn't have room for me. At the dining table, 12 chairs lined up neatly, waiting for dinner parties I was never invited to. On the mantel, photos of vacations I hadn't taken, birthdays I hadn't attended. My face appeared in none of them. I was a ghost in my own son's life. When his wife, Claire, entered the room, the air seemed to tighten. She had a way of speaking that sounded like a compliment but landed like a correction. "Oh, you didn't have to bring flowers," she said once, her eyes flicking to the cheap plastic wrap around the bouquet I had grabbed from a grocery store on my way over. "We already have arrangements delivered." She wasn't cruel, not in the obvious sense. She never raised her voice or threw me out. But her silences, her faint smiles, her sideways glances, they all told me what words never needed to. I didn't belong here. Michael didn't notice, or maybe he chose not to. He floated between conference calls and business lunches, between flights and deadlines. He wore his ambition like a tailored suit, and he seemed convinced that success would keep his world intact. But I knew better. Success is a fragile shell. Tap it the wrong way and it shatters. There was a night I'll never forget. They were hosting one of their dinners, a gathering of lawyers and executives. The table was set with crystal glasses and gold-edged plates. I sat at the far end, a piece of decoration, quiet as the candles burning down. One of Michael's colleagues asked about his childhood. "So, where'd you get your drive, Mike? What shaped you?" I leaned forward, ready to hear him say something about the long hours I worked, or the sacrifices we made, or even the small house where he first dreamed bigger. Instead, he waved his hand casually. "Oh, I've always been self-made, didn't have much help, just worked hard, you know." The words slid across the table like ice water. Nobody noticed me lower my fork. Nobody noticed the way I stared at my plate. Claire laughed and added, "Michael's always had vision. Some people are just born that way." Born that way. As if he had sprung fully formed, untouched by the nights I skipped dinner so he could eat. By the mornings I patched his sneakers with duct tape. By the weekends I bent steel and poured cement to keep a roof over his head. I told myself it was just pride talking, that maybe in a room full of men measuring themselves by their resumes, he needed to polish his own story. But the truth is, he believed it. He really thought he had built this glass house alone, forgetting the calloused hands that had laid his foundation. I drove home that night on streets slick with rain, headlights reflecting like broken glass. The windshield wipers kept time with my thoughts. Left, right, left, right. How does a father compete with a world like that? How do you stand against the shine of success when all you have to offer is memory? I parked outside my small house, the one with chipped paint and a mailbox that leaned slightly to the left. Inside, the floor creaked when I stepped on the same spot it always had. The kitchen smelled of last night's stew. My table had only 2 chairs, one of them empty for far too long. I poured myself a drink and sat down, staring at the worn grooves in the wood where years of elbows had rested. My life was quiet, ordinary. His was dazzling, loud. And somewhere between those two worlds, a chasm had opened. Still, I couldn't hate him. Love doesn't turn off because it isn't returned. I tried to remind myself that maybe this was what parenthood was always meant to be, to give until you disappear, to step back so they could step forward. But then I would hear his words again, replayed like a cruel refrain. "I don't need you anymore, Dad." And I wondered if disappearing was the same as being erased. It was a winter evening when the final cut came. The invitation arrived by accident, I think, a message sent to a group list that included me, perhaps unintentionally. A holiday dinner, formal, black tie. I almost didn't go. Something told me it wasn't meant for me, that my presence would be, at best, a tolerated oversight. But a part of me still clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, Michael wanted me there. So I put on my best suit, the one I had worn to his wedding. It hung looser now, the fabric softened with age. I polished my shoes until I could see the dull reflection of my face, lined and weary. The house glittered with lights when I arrived. Through the tall windows I could see guests already gathered, glasses raised, laughter spilling into the cold night air. I stepped inside and warmth hit me, thick with the smell of roasted meats and cinnamon. "Dad," Michael said, surprised. His smile was quick, practiced, not quite reaching his eyes. Claire's lips tightened into something that was supposed to be welcoming. "We didn't think you'd be able to make it," she murmured. The room was filled with people in crisp suits and gowns. They looked me over politely, the way one does when an extra chair appears at the table, not expected but tolerated. I took a seat at the far end. The silverware gleamed, the plates heavy with design. A string quartet played softly in the corner. I tried to eat, to join in, but conversation swirled around me like smoke, slipping through my fingers whenever I reached for it. Halfway through the evening, Michael stood. He tapped his glass with a spoon and the music quieted. "I just want to say," he began, his voice carrying easily, "how grateful I am for this year, for the growth we've had, for the home we've built, for the life we've created." Applause scattered around the table. He smiled, basking in it. Then his tone shifted, sharpened just slightly, like a knife's edge glinting under light. "People sometimes ask me what drove me, where I found the strength to get here. And the truth is," he paused, his eyes sweeping the room, "the truth is I made it on my own. Everything I've built, I built myself. I don't owe anyone for it, not anymore." The words slid into me like cold steel. Not anymore. I felt the eyes of the room flicker toward me and away again, as if everyone knew where that arrow had landed, but no one dared to look directly. Michael raised his glass. "Here's to independence, to standing on our own feet." Laughter, clinking glasses, cheers. The room erupted in agreement, and I sat there, my hands folded in my lap, the wine untouched before me. It wasn't anger that filled me. Not at first. It was something heavier, something closer to grief. Because in that moment I understood that he hadn't just stepped away from me quietly, in kitchens and car rides and unanswered phone calls. He had chosen to make it public. He had chosen to erase me in front of others, to rewrite our story with an audience applauding. I left before dessert. Snow had begun to fall, flakes catching in the streetlights like bits of ash. My breath rose in the air as I walked to my car. The laughter from inside still echoed, muffled by the walls but sharp enough to cut. I sat behind the wheel, staring at the steering column, my hands motionless. For years, I had carried the weight of him, his childhood, his struggles, his triumphs. I had carried it with pride, thinking it was what fathers did. Tonight he had set it down like an old coat, no longer useful, no longer wanted. I drove slowly through the dark streets, the tires crunching over snow. My house waited, small and quiet, a single light glowing in the window. I stepped inside and the silence pressed around me. No music, no clinking glasses, no applause. Just the hum of the heater, steady and indifferent. I hung my coat, sat at the kitchen table and poured a drink. The glass felt heavy in my hand. I thought of the boy who once ran to me with scraped knees, shouting "Daddy," with tears in his eyes. And I thought of the man who had stood tonight, raising a toast to a world that had no room for me. The thing about being cut off in public is that it leaves no room for denial. Before, I could tell myself I was imagining it, that maybe schedules and misunderstandings were to blame. But this was deliberate. He wanted people to know that he no longer needed his father. He wanted it written into the story of his life, etched there with crystal and applause. And so I sat alone in my kitchen, listening to the clock tick, feeling the weight of words that could not be unsaid. There are wounds deeper than anger, wounds that bleed in silence. And sometimes the hardest part is not the moment of the cut, but the echo of it, repeating in your head long after the room has gone quiet. 2 years after Ethan's 5th birthday, the phone rang on a night when the world was already quiet. It was late, the kind of late when even the neighbors' porch lights had gone dark. I was sitting in my armchair, the television murmuring some rerun I wasn't really watching. My glass sat half empty on the table beside me. I must have been half asleep because when the phone buzzed, it startled me, the sound sharp against the silence. At first, I thought it was a wrong number. Calls at that hour rarely carry good news, but when I lifted the receiver and heard the clipped tone of a hospital operator, my chest tightened. "Is this Mr. Flores?" the voice asked. "Yes," I said, my throat dry. "We need you to come to St. Matthew's. It's urgent. It concerns your family." For a moment I couldn't breathe. The word family landed differently now. It had been stripped bare over the past months, carved into something thin and brittle, but family was still blood, still tethered by unseen cords. "What happened?" I asked. "Your grandson," the voice replied. "He's been admitted. You'll need to speak with the attending physician." The line went dead before I could ask more. The drive to the hospital blurred past in streaks of streetlight. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than they should have, knuckles pale against the leather. Snow was falling in a slow, steady curtain, muting the world into silence. My headlights cut through it, two narrow beams carving a path forward. When I arrived, the fluorescent lights in the emergency wing seemed almost cruel in their brightness. I gave my name at the desk, and within minutes a doctor appeared, clipboard in hand, eyes serious. "Are you Mr. Flores, grandfather to Ethan?" "Yes, please, what's happened?" He glanced at me, then at the papers in his hand. "Your grandson has been diagnosed with aplastic anemia. His bone marrow isn't producing enough cells. He's very ill." The words hit like stones, dropping one after another. Ill, anemia, bone marrow, each one heavy, each one darker than the last. The doctor continued, voice steady but urgent. "He'll need a transplant. We've already tested immediate family members. His parents are not matches. Extended family is being contacted, but time is not on our side." I followed him down a hallway that smelled of antiseptic and fear. At the end, through a glass window, I saw Ethan lying on a hospital bed, his small frame swallowed by white sheets. His skin looked pale, almost translucent, and there were circles under his eyes that no child should carry. Michael was there, pacing the room like a caged animal, his tie loosened, his face ashen. Claire sat rigid in a chair, hands clenched around a tissue she hadn't used. Neither of them looked up when I entered. The sight of my grandson, the boy who once hugged my knees so tightly I nearly toppled, brought me to my knees. My hand pressed against the glass as if it could reach him, shield him. He looked so small, so breakable. "Dad," Michael said finally, his voice low. Hoarse, he didn't look at me. "They tested us, we're not matches." He swallowed, shaking his head, and for the first time in years his words didn't sound polished or certain. They sounded broken. The doctor cleared his throat. "Mr. Flores, we'd like to test you. Grandparents can sometimes be compatible. There's no guarantee, but—" "Yes," I said before he could finish. My answer came from somewhere deeper than thought. "Test me." They drew my blood in a room that smelled of latex and metal. The needle pricked, the vial filled, and the nurse labeled it carefully. As I sat there, I thought of the toast in that glittering dining room, the words that had cut me to the bone. "I don't owe anyone, not anymore." And now here we were. His son's life hanging by a thread that only I might be able to hold. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling tiles, and felt the weight of a strange truth settle over me. Sometimes the universe doesn't punish with thunder or lightning. Sometimes it answers with irony so sharp it could slice you open. The waiting was unbearable. Hours stretched like years. Michael sat with his head in his hands, his hair falling loose. Claire whispered into her phone, pacing, her heels clicking against the linoleum. I sat alone in the corner, the plastic chair digging into my back, silent as stone. Finally, the doctor returned. He held a folder in his hands, his face unreadable. "Mr. Flores," he said, "you're a perfect match." The words filled the sterile room with something heavier than air. Relief and dread, hope and fear, all tangled together. Claire pressed a hand to her mouth. Michael looked up at me for the first time in months, his eyes red, wet, disbelieving. And in that moment, he didn't look like the man who had stood in a glittering room declaring independence. He looked like my boy again, lost, frightened, in need. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The decision had already been made the moment the phone rang. The hospital room seemed smaller once the doctor left. His words lingered like a weight in the air. "You're a perfect match." They should have been a beacon, a thread of hope. Instead, silence pressed down, thick and unyielding. Michael's chair scraped against the floor as he stood. He paced, restless, as though movement itself could undo the truth. His tie hung loose, his shirt wrinkled, the polish gone from him. He looked nothing like the man who once raised a glass and declared his independence. He looked cornered. "There must be another way," he muttered. "There has to be, some registry, some donor list. People do this all the time, right?" Claire rose to meet him, her hand clutching his arm as if anchoring him. "We'll find someone," she said, her voice sharp with panic. "We'll pay whatever it takes. We'll fly him anywhere in the world. There has to be another option." The doctor, still near the doorway, shook his head gently. We're running out of time. Yes, there are registries, but matches are rare. The fact that his grandfather is compatible, it's extraordinary. We can start preparations immediately. I watched their faces twist, pride colliding with desperation. They wanted to look anywhere but at me. Even now, when the truth was laid bare, they searched for another exit, a way to keep me outside the circle. Michael ran a hand through his hair. What if something goes wrong? He's older. What if he doesn't? His voice broke before the sentence could. I let the words hang. I knew what he meant. What if I didn't survive the procedure? What if saving Ethan cost me everything? But the question wasn't about risk. It was about dependence. My son couldn't bear the thought of owing me the very thing he had so proudly declared he no longer needed. Claire's eyes flicked to me, wide and uneasy. For once she had no clever phrasing, no polite dismissal, just fear. I spoke softly, my voice steady. This isn't about debts or independence. It's about Ethan. He's a child. He deserves a chance. Michael turned toward me, his jaw tight. You think I don't know that? He's my son. The words came out raw, cracked. For a moment I saw him as he once was, a boy clutching a scraped knee, defiant in his pain. But this wasn't a scraped knee. This was a fracture running through everything, his pride, his marriage, his identity. Claire gripped his arm tighter. We can't just— Yes, we can, I interrupted. My voice surprised even me, firmer than it had been in years. I said I'll do it. The room went still. The only sound was the steady beeping of Ethan's monitor, reminding us of the urgency, the ticking clock none of us could control. Michael's shoulders sagged. He sat back down heavily, pressing the heels of his hands into his eyes. I can't ask you for this, he whispered. You didn't, I replied. I offered. The night stretched long. Nurses came and went, their shoes squeaking against the polished floor. Papers were signed, questions asked, risks explained. Words like harvest and transplant filled the space, clinical terms that masked the weight of what they meant. Claire sat rigid, barely speaking, her knuckles white around a styrofoam cup of coffee. Michael moved between the chair at Ethan's bedside and the hallway, as though distance could save him from drowning. I stayed where I was, watching the rise and fall of my grandson's chest. He stirred occasionally, eyelids fluttering, too weak to stay awake. Once he whispered something, his voice so faint I had to lean close. Grandpa. Yes, buddy, I said, taking his small hand into mine. Don't leave. I won't, I promised. He drifted back into sleep, his hand still clutching my fingers. Hours later, when the nurses dimmed the lights, Michael finally spoke again. His voice was low, almost ashamed. All these years I thought I was building something solid, he said. A life no one could touch. And now, he shook his head. Now it all comes down to you. I didn't answer. There are moments when silence speaks louder than any words, because I knew the truth he was circling but couldn't say, that sometimes the very foundation you try to bury is the only one strong enough to hold you when the ground splits open. Morning light crept through the blinds, gray and tired, as if even the sun knew this place was heavy with waiting. Hospitals always feel suspended from time, no night, no day, just a constant hum of machines and footsteps in the halls. I hadn't slept. None of us had. When the doctor finally returned, folder in hand, the room tightened. Michael stood quickly, his chair scraping the floor. Claire clutched Ethan's blanket as though fabric could anchor her. I stayed in my seat, steady, though my heart hammered. The doctor cleared his throat. We've completed the testing. The results confirm that Mr. Flores, his eyes flicked toward me, is the only suitable donor. The words landed with a thud, echoing louder than the steady beeping beside Ethan's bed. Claire inhaled sharply, a sound closer to a sob than a breath. Michael pressed a hand to his forehead, his shoulders collapsing inward. For a moment nobody spoke. The air itself seemed to refuse motion. Are you certain? Michael finally asked, his voice ragged. There's no one else, no registry, no other relatives. The doctor's tone was firm, leaving no room for illusion. We've checked. The likelihood of finding another match in time is extremely low. Your father is Ethan's best, his only chance. Silence again, deeper this time. The kind that stretches and stretches until you think it might suffocate you. I watched my son, watched pride wrestle with terror on his face. He wanted to resist, to search for another path, but every road bent back to me. He couldn't look at me, not directly. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor, as though the truth might vanish if he didn't meet it head-on. Claire finally whispered, what if it's too dangerous for him? What if— Her voice cracked and she didn't finish. The doctor folded his hands. The procedure carries risks, yes, but the alternative. He glanced at Ethan, whose chest rose and fell beneath the thin hospital sheet. The alternative is far worse. I stood then, slowly, joints stiff from the long night. My voice was quiet but sure. I said I would do it. That hasn't changed. Michael turned toward me, his eyes red. "Dad," he faltered, the words sounding foreign in his mouth. "I don't know how to ask you for this." "You don't have to," I replied. I moved to Ethan's bedside, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. His skin was warm, fragile. He stirred slightly, lips parting as if he were caught between dreams. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the words spoken in kitchens, not the toasts in glittering rooms, not the erasures and silences. What mattered was the boy lying here, the boy who deserved to run again, to laugh again, to grow into a man with his own dreams. The doctor outlined the process, speaking in clinical terms meant to soothe: extraction, anesthesia, recovery time. But the weight beneath his words was unspoken. We all knew there were risks. Claire asked questions in a rapid, brittle voice. Could complications arise? Would my age make it more dangerous? How long would recovery take? Her hands trembled as she took notes on a hospital pad, though the pen barely touched the paper. Michael didn't speak. He just sat there, elbows on his knees, face buried in his palms. I wanted to reach out, to put a hand on his shoulder, but I held back. Some bridges can't be crossed in a single step. Instead, I answered every question calmly. "Yes, I understand. Yes, I consent. Yes, I'm ready." With each answer, I felt the weight in the room shift. Slowly, the silence began to crack, not with joy, not even with hope, but with the faint sound of surrender. They could no longer pretend. I was the line between their son and the unthinkable. After the doctor left, the three of us sat in uneasy quiet. The machines hummed, Ethan breathed softly, the world outside moved on. Inside, everything was suspended, caught in the space between fear and necessity. Michael finally lifted his head. His eyes were swollen, his jaw tight. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. I looked at him, my own son, and felt the ache of years pressing against my ribs. He was right. Maybe he didn't deserve it, but Ethan did. "This isn't about what you deserve," I said gently. "It's about love, and love doesn't keep score." For the first time in what felt like forever, his eyes met mine. There was no polish there, no distance, no carefully built armor. Just a boy again, lost and terrified, looking at his father for something solid. I held his gaze. I didn't look away. The papers came in a stack thick enough to make a sound when they hit the desk. White sheets, black print, lines to sign, lines to initial. Words like consent, risk, liability crowded the margins. The language was clinical, precise, and utterly detached from what it meant. A nurse slid the folder toward me. "Take your time," she said, though her tone carried the quiet urgency of someone who knew time wasn't a luxury. Michael sat in the corner, his hands clasped, elbows digging into his knees. He stared at the floor as if the linoleum might offer an escape route. Claire stood beside him, her arms crossed tightly as though bracing herself against an invisible storm. Neither of them spoke. I reached for the pen. My fingers felt stiff, clumsy, as though they belonged to someone else. I turned to the first page and read the line aloud softly. "I understand the risks associated with the procedure." Risks. The doctor had explained them: bleeding, infection, possible long-term complications. He had said the words carefully, clinically, but I had heard what he meant. At my age, things could go wrong. I sat back for a moment, the pen hovering above the page. A memory rose unbidden. Michael at 10 years old, crouched over a little league field, the bat too big for his hands. I remembered shouting encouragement from the bleachers, my voice hoarse with pride when he finally connected with the ball. The look on his face, that mixture of surprise and triumph, was etched into me. The memory lingered, then shifted to Ethan. His small hand gripping mine at the park, his laugh ringing as he begged me to push the swing higher. The weight of him on my shoulders, the warmth of his cheek against the top of my head. The risks didn't matter, not when the alternative was a life cut short. I pressed the pen to paper and signed. Each page carried another line, another affirmation that I understood the danger, that I released them from blame, that I was willing. With every stroke of ink, something loosened inside me. It was as if I were unburdening years of silence, of swallowed words, of being pushed aside. The final page was thicker, a yellow duplicate beneath the white. I signed it slowly, deliberately, making sure each letter was clear. My hand shook, but the name came out steady. Dennis Flores. When I set the pen down, the nurse gathered the papers quickly, her movements efficient. Practiced, she gave me a small nod before leaving the room. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Michael finally lifted his head. His eyes were rimmed with red, his face drawn. "Why?" he asked. The word was thin, fragile, as though it might break under its own weight. "Because he's my grandson," I said simply. Michael shook his head. "No, I mean after everything. After what I said. After the way he trailed off, unable to finish. I looked at him, my son who had once declared he didn't need me. I thought of the glass house, the glittering parties, the toasts that erased me. All of it seemed so small now, so hollow against the sound of Ethan's shallow breathing. "You don't stop being a father," I said quietly. "Not when your child says he doesn't need you, not when the world tells you you're finished. Not ever." Claire made a sound then, half a sob, half a protest. Her hand pressed against her mouth. For the first time her eyes met mine without the veil of judgment. They were wet, uncertain, almost pleading. Michael dropped his head into his hands again, his shoulders shaking. I didn't move to comfort him. Not yet. This wasn't a moment for embraces or quick forgiveness. This was a moment to let the weight of reality sink into him, to let him feel the gravity of what love meant when it asked nothing in return. Later, when the nurse returned with a clipboard and wristband, I extended my arm without hesitation. The band clicked shut around my wrist, a small strip of plastic that declared me a donor, a patient, a man stepping willingly into risk. I caught Michael watching. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, he nodded once, almost imperceptibly. It wasn't gratitude, not yet. It was acknowledgement, a first crack in the wall he had built between us. As I stood to follow the nurse, I glanced back at Ethan. His face was peaceful in sleep, his small chest rising and falling in fragile rhythm. For him, I would sign 1,000 pages, take 1,000 risks. Love isn't measured in safety. It's measured in the willingness to give when giving costs you something. And with my name on those papers, I had given everything I could. The corridor to the operating theater was colder than the rest of the hospital. The walls were bare, washed in sterile white, and the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and something sharper I couldn't place. A nurse guided the gurney forward, her shoes squeaking softly against the floor. I lay back, the thin blanket drawn over me, my hands folded on my chest like a man preparing for confession. Overhead, the fluorescent lights passed in rhythm, one after another, each a pale square of light flashing above me. It felt like moving through a tunnel, each flicker marking another step away from the life I knew. Michael walked alongside, his steps uncertain, his eyes fixed on the floor. He hadn't spoken since they wheeled me out of the room. Claire was behind him, her arms wrapped around herself as though she were holding together a body that might shatter. I could feel the weight of their silence pressing down, but I didn't resent it. Silence had its place. It gave space for truths too heavy to name. At the double doors, the nurse stopped. "This is as far as you can go," she told them gently. Michael finally looked at me. His mouth opened, then closed again. His eyes were red, swollen, searching. I gave him a small nod. That was enough. Words would come later, or maybe they wouldn't. For now, this was all either of us could manage. The doors swung open, and I was wheeled into the bright world beyond. The operating room was a cathedral of light. Machines hummed quietly, their screens pulsing with green and blue lines. Stainless steel gleamed under the lamps, every surface spotless, unforgiving. The doctors and nurses moved like figures in a ritual, masked and gloved, their voices low but steady. A young anesthesiologist leaned over me. "We'll take good care of you, Mr. Flores," she said, her eyes kind above the mask. I nodded. "Do what you must." As she adjusted the Roman 4, I closed my eyes and thought of Ethan. His face pale in the hospital bed, lips whispering, "Grandpa, don't leave." I thought of his laughter, of the way he once clapped his hands when I built towers of blocks for him to knock down. I thought of him running across the yard, hair wild in the wind. If this was the price for him to laugh again, it was a bargain. The mask came down, cool air brushing my face. "Count backward from 10, the anesthesiologist instructed softly. I smiled faintly. Numbers had never meant much to me. I counted years instead. 10. Michael's first steps across the kitchen floor, his mother cheering. 9. The day he rode his bike without training wheels, my hands letting go though he didn't know it. 8. The little league game, the crack of the bat, the grin that split his face. 7. His high school graduation, the weight of pride heavier than any brick I'd ever carried. 6. The wedding, him in his sharp suit, me fumbling with my tie, trying not to cry. 5. Ethan's birth, his tiny hand curling around my finger, fragile as new glass. 4. The first time Ethan called me grandpa, the word tumbling out like a song. 3. His laugh at the park, the swing soaring higher, his joy echoing in the air. 2. The hospital room, his small hand gripping mine, whispering, "Don't leave." 1. The moment I signed my name, choosing him above all else. 0. Darkness didn't come all at once. It folded in gently like the curtain of a stage drawn closed, leaving behind only the faint sound of machines and the steady rhythm of my own heart. And then nothing. When I woke, the world was blurred. Voices floated in fragments, pieces of sentences I couldn't string together. The hum of machines returned, softer now like distant waves. My throat was dry, my body heavy, but I was still here. Through the haze, I saw Michael standing by the bed. His face was streaked with tears he hadn't bothered to wipe away. His hand hovered near mine, unsure if he had the right to take it. I wanted to tell him he did, that he always had, but my voice failed me, so I squeezed his fingers instead. His breath caught, and in that single sound I heard the breaking of something hard, the surrender of a man who had carried his pride too long. The surgery was over. Ethan's chance at life had begun, and though my body ached, my heart felt lighter than it had in years. The first thing I saw clearly when I woke was the pale ceiling, lined with thin cracks that branched like veins. For a moment, I thought I was still in the operating room, but then the muted light and the hush of the recovery ward settled around me. My body felt heavy, drained, but alive. Beside me, in a chair pulled close to the bed, sat Michael. His posture was slumped, elbows on his knees, his face buried in his hands. His suit jacket was gone, his shirt untucked, sleeves rolled up like he'd been stripped of his armor. When he lifted his head, I saw something I hadn't seen in years, his eyes without defenses. They were red, rimmed with exhaustion, but more than that, they were raw. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us wasn't the cold kind anymore. It was heavy, trembling, filled with words he couldn't quite form. Finally, he leaned forward. His hand, hesitant, reached for mine. "Dad," he said, the word breaking in his throat, "I don't know how to face you." I squeezed his fingers lightly, though my arm felt like stone. "You just did." He bowed his head, tears slipping through the cracks he had fought so hard to keep sealed. "I told the world I didn't need you. I told myself I didn't. And now," his voice faltered, "now everything I have, everything that matters, exists because of you." The confession didn't come like an apology. It came like a man drowning, gasping for the surface, desperate for air. I watched him, my son who had once believed he stood taller by cutting away the roots that had held him. I saw the weight of his pride crumbling, leaving behind the boy I remembered, the one who used to curl into my lap, the one who believed I could fix anything. "You don't owe me," I said softly. "Not for this, not for anything. You never did." He shook his head violently. "Don't say that. Don't let me off so easy. I've been blind, selfish, arrogant. I've let Claire convince me that I could build a life by erasing the one who gave me mine. And now," his voice broke again, "now my son lives because of you. How do I carry that?" I closed my eyes, exhaustion pressing against me, but I managed to whisper, "The same way I carried you, with love, with no ledger, no score." For the first time since he was a child, Michael wept openly in front of me. His shoulders shook, his breaths came ragged, and he pressed his forehead against our joined hands as though anchoring himself. I felt my own tears slide down, quiet, steady. They weren't tears of triumph or vindication. They weren't the satisfaction of being proven right. They were the tears of a father who had been waiting years for this, an opening, a crack in the wall, a glimpse of his son's heart. The machines hummed around us, steady, indifferent. Outside, I could hear the wheels of gurneys and the soft murmur of nurses, but in that small space, time seemed to hold still. Later, Claire entered. Her face was pale, mascara smudged at the corners of her eyes. She froze in the doorway when she saw Michael hunched beside me, our hands clasped. For a moment she looked as though she might retreat, but then she stepped closer, her voice low. "They say Ethan is stable. The transplant, it's working." The words filled the air like a fragile kind of light, one that you hold carefully because it might shatter if you move too quickly. Michael exhaled a sound that was half a sob, half a laugh. Relief poured out of him like water breaking through a dam. He leaned back in his chair, his hand still gripping mine, and whispered, "Thank God." Claire's eyes flicked to me then. For once there was no distance in them, no veil of superiority, only recognition and something that looked almost like gratitude, though she couldn't quite shape it into words. I nodded gently. That was enough. When they left the room briefly to see Ethan, I stayed behind, the quiet pressing in. My body ached, my strength was thin, but my heart was steady. For the first time in a long time, I felt seen, not as a burden, not as a relic, not as someone written out of the story, but as a father, as a grandfather, as a man whose love had found its way through silence and pride and walls built too high. And as the faint sounds of my grandson's laughter drifted down the hall, I closed my eyes and let the weight of it all settle into me. The hallway outside Ethan's room smelled faintly of disinfectant and warm plastic, the kind of scent you learn to live with when days blur into nights inside a hospital. When they wheeled me back from recovery, still weak, I asked the nurse to stop by his door. I wanted to see him, even if just through glass. But when the door opened, I heard it first, the faint, steady rhythm of his breathing. Not labored, not shallow anymore, but deeper, stronger. Machines still whispered their constant song, but his chest rose and fell with a quiet determination all its own. Michael was at his bedside. He sat hunched forward, elbows resting on the rails, his hand covering Ethan's small fingers. His head bowed so low that I thought he might fall asleep like that, collapsed into the gravity of relief. Claire stood on the other side, her arms wrapped around herself, tears streaming silently down her face as she watched her son's eyelids flutter in sleep. The nurse slid my chair closer. My legs trembled, but I leaned forward, wanting to be near enough to see. Ethan's cheeks had more color now, a faint blush returning where pallor had lived. His lips were less gray, his skin less fragile. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but to a grandfather's eyes it was everything. Michael looked up when he realized I was there. His face was raw with exhaustion, but in his eyes there was something new, something I hadn't seen in years. It wasn't pity or obligation or even apology. It was recognition. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Instead, he shifted slightly, moving his chair so there was space for me beside him. I lowered myself into that space slowly, my body aching but my spirit lighter than it had been in years. For a long while we just sat there, 3 generations in one small room, bound together by something beyond words. Ethan stirred in his sleep, his fingers twitching against Michael's hand. His lips parted and a faint sound escaped, something between a sigh and a murmur. Michael leaned closer, whispering, "I'm here, buddy, I'm right here." And then, softer still, he added, "We're all here." The words hung in the air, fragile and profound. We're all here. For once they weren't an exclusion or a performance or a polished statement made to others. They were truth. The night stretched on in quiet vigil. Nurses came and went, checking monitors, adjusting tubes, scribbling notes. But we remained rooted to the spot. Claire dozed in the chair near the window, her shoulders curling inward. Michael sat upright, his eyes rarely leaving Ethan. And me, I sat in silence, watching, remembering, breathing with them. At one point Michael spoke, his voice low, almost uncertain. "When I was a kid, I used to think you could fix anything. A broken toy, a scraped knee, even the radiator when it clanked in the winter. You always had an answer." He looked at me, his eyes wet. "I forgot that somewhere along the way. I forgot that you were the one holding it all together." I wanted to say something back, something wise, but all I managed was a nod. My throat was too thick, my chest too heavy. Sometimes silence carries more truth than words. Hours later, Ethan's eyes flickered open. Just a slit at first, then wider, hazy with sleep, but undeniably awake. He looked around the room, unfocused, then found Michael's face. "Dad," he whispered. Michael's breath caught. He leaned close, pressing his lips to his son's forehead. "Yeah, buddy, I'm right here." Ethan's gaze drifted, blurry, until it landed on me. His small lips curved into the faintest smile. "Grandpa," he said, the syllables fragile but whole. My chest clenched, tears blurred my vision. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched his fingers. He squeezed weakly, but it was enough. Michael glanced at me, and in that look something passed between us. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a bridge, thin, trembling, but real. For the first time in years, we sat together, father and son, not as adversaries or strangers, but as 2 men bound by the same boy's breath. And in the hush of that hospital room with machines humming and night pressing at the windows, we stayed. Not speaking, not needing to. Just being there. All of us. The room was dim, the only light spilling from the monitor that traced Ethan's heartbeat, steady and green. The beeping was softer now, less urgent, more like a lullaby. It was deep into the night, and Claire had finally drifted into sleep, curled in the chair by the window. The world beyond the blinds was black and silent. Michael hadn't moved in hours. He sat rigid at Ethan's bedside, his hand still wrapped around his son's smaller one, his eyes fixed on the boy's face as though willing him to stay. The shadows beneath his eyes had deepened, his jaw slack with exhaustion, yet he refused to close his eyes. I watched him from my chair, my own body weak but anchored by something stronger than fatigue. For years I had seen him build walls, layer upon layer, brick over brick. Tonight, in the glow of machines and the hush of breath, those walls began to crumble. Suddenly, Ethan stirred. His small body shifted beneath the blanket, his lips parting in a faint whimper. Michael leaned forward instantly, his voice breaking with tenderness. "Hey, buddy, I'm here, Daddy's here." Ethan's eyelids fluttered, but he didn't fully wake. His hand tightened faintly around his father's. Michael bowed his head, pressing his forehead to their joined hands, and in that moment the dam inside him gave way. His shoulders began to shake. At first it was silent, a tremor barely visible. Then the sound came, low and raw, pulled from somewhere deep. He wept, not the quiet tears of a man trying to maintain dignity, but the open, unrestrained sobs of someone finally stripped bare. He bent over the bed, his tears falling onto the white sheets, his body curling inward as if he were folding into the pain. Years of pride, years of distance, years of pretending he needed no one, all of it spilled out in broken cries. And then through the sobs the word came. "Dad." It was a whisper at first, cracked and unsteady. He gripped Ethan's hand tighter, his head still bowed. "Dad," louder now, choked, desperate. "I need you." The sound of it pierced through me. For years I had longed to hear that word again, not as a title dismissed or a formality stripped of warmth, but as what it once was, a lifeline. And now here it was, raw and trembling, pulled from the heart of my son as though it had been buried deep inside, waiting for this night to be unearthed. My throat closed, my eyes burning. I wanted to reach for him, to place a hand on his back, to steady him the way I used to when nightmares woke him as a boy, but I couldn't move. My body was weak, tethered to my own recovery, so I gave him what I could, my voice. "I'm here, Michael," I whispered. "I've always been here." He lifted his head then, his face streaked with tears, his eyes swollen but open. He looked at me, not past me, not through me, but at me. And in that gaze, for the first time in years, I saw my son. Not the polished man in the suit, not the distant figure behind the glass house, but the boy who had once trusted me with everything. "Dad," he said again, steadier now, his voice breaking but clear. The word filled the room, wrapping around us like something sacred. For a long time we sat in that fragile silence, broken only by Ethan's steady breaths and the hum of the machines. Michael wiped at his face clumsily, still clutching his son's hand as though he might vanish if he let go. He turned to me slowly. "I don't deserve you," he said, voice hoarse. "I don't deserve what you've done." I shook my head gently. "This isn't about deserve, it never was, it's about love. That's the only thing that matters." His lips trembled, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. And though he didn't speak again, the word he had given me, Dad, hung between us, alive, renewed, more powerful than any apology could ever be. In that dim hospital room, with night pressing hard against the windows and 3 generations breathing the same air, the fractures of years began to mend. Not with grand gestures, not with polished speeches, but with a single word returned, spoken through tears, carrying everything he had once withheld. And for the first time in so long, I allowed myself to believe that healing, real healing, had begun. Michael didn't sleep that night. He stayed in the chair at Ethan's bedside, his hand never leaving his son's. I could see the exhaustion etched into his face, but behind it was something else, something shifting, unsettled. His eyes, when they wandered from Ethan, often landed on me. He didn't speak, but I could tell. Memory had found him. At some point just before dawn, the silence broke. His voice was low, rough, as if he were speaking not only to me but to himself. "I remember the night the furnace broke," he said. "I must have been 8, maybe 9. The house was freezing. I woke up to the sound of clanging in the basement. I came down and you were down there with a wrench in your hand, sweat on your forehead, your breath fogging in the cold. You worked for hours, cursing under your breath until it rattled back to life. He rubbed his face, shaking his head. I'd forgotten that, or maybe I chose to, but I can see it now like it was yesterday. I stayed quiet. Sometimes memory doesn't need an audience, it just needs release. He continued, words tumbling out in uneven rhythm. And that winter when the snow came so heavy, I had outgrown my boots, but you didn't have the money for new ones. So you lined them with plastic bags, taped them around my ankles so the snow wouldn't soak through. I thought it was funny then, stomping around like a scarecrow. But now, his voice cracked. Now I realize you were making sure my feet stayed dry while yours froze. He paused, his chest heaving as though each memory carried weight. His gaze drifted to the floor, then lifted again far away to somewhere only he could see. I remember the night before my SATs. You worked a double, came home late, and still sat with me at the kitchen table. I was half asleep, staring at equations I didn't understand. You brewed coffee you couldn't afford, sat across from me and said, "We'll figure it out together." You never finished high school, but you stayed until my eyes shut. I didn't even thank you. His voice grew unsteady and his fingers tightened around Ethan's. "And graduation," he whispered. I looked out into the crowd and I saw you standing in the back, still in your work boots, dirt on your shirt. You clapped louder than anyone. I was embarrassed then. Embarrassed by the way you looked, by what my friends might think. God, I was such a fool. He bowed his head, pressing his forehead to Ethan's hand as though the weight of those recollections was too much to bear. The memories poured from him like floodwater breaking through a dam. "Mom's funeral," he said softly. "You held me up when I couldn't stand. I remember thinking you looked like stone, so strong. But later I found you sitting in the garage, crying into your hands so I wouldn't see. And I never asked how you survived that night. I just let you carry it alone." He looked at me then, his eyes wet, his face hollowed by years of silence. I buried all of it. I told myself I'd built this life on my own, but every brick was laid on top of you. I couldn't speak. My throat ached, my chest burned. To hear him finally name the moments I had lived, moments I thought had vanished without trace, it was both healing and breaking all at once. He turned back to Ethan, brushing a stray curl from his son's forehead. His voice dropped into a whisper. "I almost lost him, Dad. I almost lost everything because I forgot where I came from, because I forgot you." The word hung in the air, forgot. Not erased, not gone, forgotten, which meant memory could return, which meant it already had. Outside, dawn was breaking, thin light seeping through the blinds. The hospital stirred awake, the wheels of carts rolling, the murmur of morning rounds. But inside that room, time slowed, suspended between past and present. Michael leaned back in his chair, his hand still resting on Ethan's, his eyes heavy but unblinking. "I see it all now," he murmured. "Every sacrifice, every moment, and I can't believe I turned my back on it." His words weren't polished, not the kind you give at a dinner table to impress a room. They were raw, unvarnished, drawn straight from the marrow of regret. And as I watched him crumble beneath the weight of his own remembering, I realized that sometimes healing begins not with forgiveness, but with memory returning, truth reclaimed, roots rediscovered, love remembered after being buried too long. Morning light slanted through the blinds, a pale gold that softened the hard lines of the hospital room. The night of tears and memories had left Michael drained, his shoulders sagging, his eyes swollen but clear. He sat with Ethan's hand still folded in his, unwilling to let go even as the boy slept peacefully, his breathing steady now. I shifted in my chair, every muscle aching but my heart strangely light. I had listened to my son pour out regrets, the walls of pride falling brick by brick. Now came the moment neither of us had spoken aloud, the one I had carried silently for years. "Michael," I said softly. He looked up quickly as though afraid I might vanish if he blinked. "Yeah, Dad." The word still startled me, the way it slipped from him now without hesitation. It had been gone so long that hearing it felt like sunlight after endless gray. I managed a faint smile. "You don't need to punish yourself with guilt. What's done is done. I don't hold it against you." Tears welled in his eyes again, but I lifted a hand, weak though it was. "Listen to me. Forgiveness is easy, but respect, that's the part you have to choose." He frowned, his mouth opening as if to argue, then closing again. He leaned forward, searching my face. "I do respect you, Dad. I lost sight of it. I shook my head slowly. Respect isn't something you say. It's how you live. It's how you treat the people who gave you everything, even when the world tells you they have nothing left to offer. It's not about money or houses or success. It's about dignity, and dignity doesn't retire. The words hung heavy, but I knew they had to. Love without boundaries turns into sacrifice without honor, and I had lived too long in that silence. Michael rubbed his face, his hands trembling. I thought I had to be bigger than you, stronger. I thought success meant proving I didn't need anyone, but all I did was shrink you in my eyes, and in doing that I shrank myself. His voice cracked and he gripped Ethan's hand tighter. I don't want to do that anymore. I don't want Ethan growing up thinking strength means turning your back on the people who raised you. I studied him, this man who was once my boy, the pride and pain of my life. Then show him, I said quietly. Show him by how you live. Not with speeches, not with polished words, but with respect. For me, for your mother's memory, for the truth of where you came from. He nodded, his face wet, his chest heaving. I will, I swear it. For a moment the room was silent again except for the machines and Ethan's steady breaths. The boy stirred, murmuring something incoherent, and both of us leaned closer instinctively. Michael brushed his son's hair back from his forehead, his touch trembling. Watching him, I felt a wave of tenderness rise. Despite everything, despite the years of distance, here was a man trying to be a father the way I had once tried, with imperfect hands, with stubborn pride, with love hidden beneath mistakes. Michael, I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. He looked at me instantly. I never stopped being your dad, even when you didn't see me, even when you didn't want me. But being a father doesn't mean erasing yourself. It doesn't mean giving without end. It means giving with love and holding on to respect. That's the lesson I want you to carry forward. His face broke, the tears flowing freely again. But this time there was something steadier beneath them. Not just grief, but resolve. I hear you, he said, and I won't forget again. The nurse came in then, adjusting Ethan's Roman 4, scribbling notes on a chart. The morning bustle of the hospital was beginning, the hum of voices and the wheels of carts echoing faintly down the hall. But inside that room we remained still, wrapped in the fragile bond being rebuilt between us. Michael leaned back in his chair, his hand never leaving Ethan's, his eyes on me. And for the first time in years I felt not just forgiven or acknowledged, but respected. It was a fragile thing, still forming, still delicate, but it was real, and for now that was enough. Weeks passed and the hospital stay became a memory replaced by the rhythm of healing. Ethan's cheeks grew fuller, color returned to his skin, and laughter began to echo in his voice again. The boy who had once looked so fragile now tugged at his father's sleeve in the yard, begging for one more toss of the ball. Each throw carried a weight lifted from us all. Michael changed too. It wasn't dramatic at first, no grand gestures or rehearsed speeches, but in the smaller, steadier ways. He called me more often, not out of obligation, but simply to ask, "How are you feeling?" He stopped by my house, sometimes unannounced, carrying groceries or fixing the loose hinge on my back door. Once, he even sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee. No phones, no rush, just presence. It was what I had wanted for years, not the groceries, not the repairs, but his company, his presence. The acknowledgement that my life still held a place in his. But with his newfound closeness came something else, a temptation I recognized. He wanted to fold me back into his life completely, to close the gap by pulling me into his home, his schedule, his orbit. "Dad," he said one evening, his voice hopeful, "why don't you move in with us? We've got the space. Ethan would love having you around all the time. Claire," he hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Claire agrees it would be good for you." I looked at him across the kitchen table, the same table where I had once watched him study for exams, his head bent over books. His eyes now were softer, earnest, a boy again in the shell of a man. It would have been easy to say yes, to let myself be drawn into that bright house with its wide rooms and tall glass doors, to trade my quiet evenings for the company of family dinners and the sound of my grandson's laughter echoing down the hall. But love, I had learned, isn't only about giving. Sometimes it's about refusing to vanish. "I appreciate it," I said gently. "But no, this house is mine. These walls, this roof, they carry my life in them. I won't give that up." Michael's brow furrowed. "But you wouldn't have to worry anymore. We could take care of you." I smiled, shaking my head. I don't need to be taken care of, I need to be respected. And respect means seeing me stand on my own 2 feet. I'll always be here when you need me, but I won't be your shadow. The words stung him. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes fell. But then he nodded slowly, understanding dawning. I get it, he said quietly. You don't want to disappear into my life, you want to keep your own. Exactly. For years, he had wanted to erase my presence. Now he wanted to erase my independence. Both were born from the same mistake, thinking love was only complete when one person absorbed the other. But that night, as he sat at my table, he began to see what I meant. He looked around at the small kitchen, the old clock ticking on the wall, the worn grooves in the table where countless elbows had rested. He saw my life not as a relic, but as something whole in itself. This place feels like home, he admitted softly. I'd forgotten what that felt like. Ethan visited often after that. He'd burst through the door with the energy only children carry, running straight to the jar of cookies on the counter. He filled the house with noise, toys scattered across the floor, laughter bouncing off the walls. Michael came too, sometimes staying, sometimes just dropping Ethan off so the boy could spend an afternoon with me. Those afternoons were my treasure. We built towers of blocks, read books with silly voices, walked down the street for ice cream. Each time, Michael watched from the doorway or the porch, his eyes softer than I had ever seen them. I knew then that our family was not what it had been before, it was something new. Not perfect, not without scars, but stitched back together with threads stronger than pride. One evening, as Michael picked Ethan up, he paused at the door. "Dad," he said, his voice steady, "thank you for setting me straight, for reminding me what respect really means." I nodded, resting a hand briefly on his shoulder. "You're welcome. Just don't forget again." He smiled, small but genuine. "I won't." As they left, I stood in the doorway, the cool night air brushing against my face. I watched my son buckle his boy into the car, watched him glance back at me with eyes no longer distant, no longer clouded. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a ghost in their lives. I felt like a man standing in his own, strong and steady, with love that no longer erased but endured. The seasons shifted while Ethan healed. Winter's sharp edges softened into spring, snow melting into rivers that ran fast and clear. The world outside the hospital resumed its rhythm, trees budding, sidewalks warming beneath the sun. Inside my small house, life began again too, slowly, gently. Ethan visited often. At first he came with his parents, cautious and fragile, his body still regaining its strength. But soon, he was bounding up my porch steps with the energy only children carry, his voice bright as birdsong. His laugh filled the rooms that had sat quiet for too long. Toys cluttered my floor, crayons rolled under chairs, and the cookie jar emptied faster than I could keep up. One Saturday evening, after dinner of spaghetti and garlic bread, Ethan pulled out the old wooden blocks I had kept tucked away in a closet. He spread them across the living room rug and demanded I help him build a tower as tall as the ceiling. So we built. My hands, still stiff from the procedure, trembled as I stacked the blocks, but his small fingers steadied mine. Every time the tower wobbled, he giggled, and when it fell, he clapped and shouted, "Again, Grandpa." Michael watched from the armchair. He had traded his suit for jeans and a worn t-shirt. His face was tired, but not in the same way as before. This was the tiredness of a man who worked with his heart as much as his hands. Claire sat beside him, quieter than usual, her eyes soft as she watched her son laugh. For a long time we stayed like that, the three of us spanning 3 generations, bound together by the boy who now carried both our names and our hopes. Later that night, after Ethan had finally collapsed into sleep on the couch, Michael carried him to the guest room. He returned to the kitchen where I was rinsing dishes. For a while he just stood in the doorway watching. "You're different here," he said finally. I glanced up. "Different how?" He leaned against the frame, arms crossed. "Lighter, stronger, this house, it's you. I didn't see it before, but now I get it. You're not just part of my life, you've built your own, and that's what makes you Dad." The words, spoken with calm certainty, landed deeper than any apology. I dried my hands, turned to face him. "And you're not just my son anymore. You're a father now, that's the weight you carry. It's heavier than money or houses, but it's the only weight worth carrying." He nodded slowly, his eyes damp but clear. "I know, and I won't forget again." When morning came, sunlight streamed through the blinds, falling across Ethan's sleeping face. I sat at the table with a cup of coffee, the steam rising in thin curls, watching the boy breathe in peaceful rhythm. Michael joined me, silent at first, then spoke. "You once told me respect isn't words, it's how you live. I think I finally understand." I smiled faintly. "Good. Then teach him that, not with speeches, with how you treat people, with how you love." He reached across the table, his hand covering mine. "Thank you," he said simply, "not just for the marrow, not just for the nights in the hospital, for everything, for every sacrifice he had finally remembered, for being here still." I squeezed his hand. "Don't thank me, just live it." That evening after they left, I sat alone in the quiet house. The toys were still scattered across the rug, crayons still rolled under the chairs, the echoes of laughter still clung to the walls. And for the first time in years, the silence that followed didn't feel empty. It felt full, because I knew now that I wasn't forgotten, I wasn't erased. I wasn't a shadow, I was a father, a grandfather, a man whose love had endured every wound, every silence, every wall. And in the end, that love had stitched us back together. Not perfectly, not seamlessly, but enough. Because family, I realized, isn't about needing. It isn't about debts or obligations or who owes what to whom. Family is about presence. It's about showing up even when you've been pushed away. It's about never leaving even when the world tells you you're no longer wanted. Love doesn't disappear, it waits. And when the moment comes, it answers. That night I poured myself a glass of whiskey, the good kind I'd been saving. I sat on the porch as the sky turned violet, the air soft with spring. I raised the glass, not in bitterness, not in triumph, but in gratitude. To family, I whispered. To love that doesn't leave. The wind stirred, carrying with it the faintest sound of children's laughter, as if the world itself agreed. And I let the evening settle around me, warm and whole. To everyone listening to this story, thank you for being here, for walking with me through every chapter, every tear, every moment of love and loss. Stories like this remind us that no matter how far we drift, no matter how much pride or silence divides us, there is always a way back, through memory, through respect, through love that refuses to give up. If this story touched you, if it reminded you of your own family, of the people who stood behind you even when you forgot, I ask you to carry that love forward. Show it. Live it. Don't wait until it's almost too late to say dad, mom, grandpa, grandma. Say it now. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories of family, of forgiveness, of the strength we find in each other, please subscribe to this channel. It helps us keep telling these stories, keeps the light burning in a world that often feels dark. Take care of yourselves. Take care of the people you love. And may your homes always be filled with health, happiness, and the unshakable bond of family. Good night and God bless.